Okay, so this is the fifth lecture, I believe, on the topic of social psychology. And in the last lecture, we were talking about, or I we were talking about love as attachment and a matching hypothesis and friendship. And in this one, I want to cover prejudice and perhaps get into in-group and out-group. So if you take the sociology class, we also talk about prejudice in there, and I think I mentioned in a previous video lecture what separates prejudice from discrimination. So prejudice is an attitude, it's an idea, and that will no doubt be a quiz question somewhere along the way. And one way you can maybe try to keep this term straight is you can take it apart. So if you take this apart, you have to prejudge. So to prejudge, and usually it's a negative attitude. Our textbook talks about it being a negative attitude, but certainly you could hold positive prejudices too, and that's when you have prejudged a group of people to be, say, superior or to have positive qualities. But usually when we talk about the term, we're talking about it as having negative qualities. And then this isn't probably the right context, but like if you were to study race and ethnicity and you get into the conversation of what's anti-racism and things like this we talk about, or those ideas have, like, there's no such thing as reverse prejudice, and because prejudice is conventionally or traditionally it's a negative attitude held by a dominant group over a subordinate group. Okay, so that's sort of what it goes on to say, is that it's group differences, and it's usually a term that we associate with negative attitudes about group differences. And the thing about prejudices is they're generally established by the powerful. Okay, so there are different times throughout history and in certain social contexts where people's prejudices are stronger, and your book describes three of them. One is when there's a limited number of resources. So when jobs are scarce, or when food is scarce, or when things are feeling particularly vulnerable. So times of war or civil unrest, or when there's some fairly rapid social change. That's when you start to see people's really strong prejudices or negative attitudes towards another sort of seep out, is when things are changing, and particularly when the group it's when the group things are changing in a way that they don't like, or that puts them in a position where they perceive to have fewer social resources, or when they so a classic one is where white folk are more likely to hold negative attitudes towards, say, immigrants coming to the United States, because they feel that the world is changing from their perspective, and jobs that they may have a hard time finding a job. So this is a group that they feel or believe have attitudes that they're taking their jobs, right? And that's a resource that's scarce, jobs, social changes happening, and you're changing the rules on me, and I don't like any of that, so I'm going to hold negative attitudes. That also is scapegoat, but I'm getting way ahead of myself here. And so these prejudices, attitudes, and the difference between being, say, prejudiced and ignorant and being prejudiced and a bigot is when you've been shown that there are that your ideas are not always true, but yet you still hold on to those ideas, right? So just to use say the one about undocumented people. So you meet a brown person who speaks Spanish, and you hold a negative prejudicial attitude that they must be undocumented, even though you've been told, and you meet undocumented people, but you still believe that all brown people who speak Spanish are undocumented. That would make someone a bigot, as opposed to, say, just ignorant. There's a concept here called stereotype threat, and this is a kind of not a term we hear about all the time. You hear about it more in sort of human resources stuff. But the idea of a stereotype threat is that if I approach another individual with a prejudicial idea. Like I assume that because they belong to a certain social group, they are not going to perform as well academically. I then treat them in such a way that they don't have the same kind of resources, academic resources, and lo and behold, they end up not performing very well, right? So I've sort of reinforced or I've perpetuated that group difference. What a stereotype threat says is that people of the stereotyped group already know the biases that you have towards them, and so they may go ahead and act that way because they know it doesn't matter how they act, even if this individual, even if say, I'm trying to think of a really good example that's not potentially controversial. But say you're in a sixth grade classroom, right? And the that all of these children that belong to the Williams family, they always get in trouble. So here comes baby Williams, and it's his turn to be in your sixth grade classroom. Well, every other Williams kid you've ever had has been in trouble, has been a troublemaker. So you approach baby Williams, the third one or the fourth one in the family, and you're just already prepared for them to be a troublemaker. Well, baby Williams is not a troublemaker, but because he knows that you're going to assume that he is a troublemaker, he's going to go ahead and be a troublemaker because there might as well, right? So there's that's in the sociology too, but it's the idea that if you already expect a certain behavior out of me because you hold biases towards my group, I might as well act that way, right? I might as well just self-fulfilling prophecy. If you already think that, 48-year-old women are going to be conservative and uptight, well, I might as well be conservative and uptight, because even if I'm not, you're not going to see me any different. That's what you're going to think about who I am. So that's what we mean by stereotype threat. So then the components of what a prejudice is. This should sound a little bit like when we were talking about emotions, right? When we were talking about emotions, we had the cognitive, right? We had the thoughts that people had. So remember, prejudices are attitudes. So we have thoughts, we have the cognitive component, and then in the emotion, we have the physical piece, right? Well, in this case, the emotional piece that comes with the thoughts, right? That's your emotional component. And then finally, you have the behavioral part of what a prejudice or of prejudice. So you have the thoughts that causes feelings, and then you act in a certain way to act upon. And that's when then it becomes a discrimination. But our book doesn't. We're not actually going to go down that. Well, this says discrimination right there in the handout. There are some pretty interesting theories coming out of evolutionary psychology, though, that talk about what prejudices are, or what biases are, group biases. And it boils down to that evolutionarily, in order for our species to have been successful all these millennia on the planet, that we learned very quickly how to decide if a group was in group, was a part of our kin group, or if it was out group. So if you appeared, if you didn't look like us, if you didn't look like my tribe or my clan, then you were a member of the out group. And I didn't know. My group we don't really know what you want with us. So at an evolutionary level, we're predisposed to judge people who are individuals of the outside group as a way of protection. So imagine there's 2 million or 2,000 people on the planet, and you and your little clan are over here, and somebody from the other side of the continent shows up. They're going to look different than you because they're going to have a different gene pool, right? They're going to have different facial structures, maybe different hair color, and because they look different, it's very clear that they're an outsider. Well, outsiders are potentially threatening. So I'm biologically, this is the social psychology theory, please, that I am biologically predisposed to fear you because you may want to harm me. I don't know what your motivation is. And so some of the social psychologists have argued that prejudice, and then you fast forward and we put a label on this, we call it racism, but some of the social psychologists have argued that this is what explains our survival as a species on the planet. And the cognitive shortcut that we were talking about in terms of stereotype, that's the way that our neurology has summarized all of this information. We don't have time to stand here and say, oh, wait, are you like my people or are you not like my people? So we jump to these very rapid summations and we judge them. Now, you fast forward and the world is a different place than it was 2 millennia ago, but you still end up like this slide talks about, which is in groups, people that are like me, could be women, could be white, could be educated, you know, who knows. And then you have out groups, people who are different than you. In-group, out-group homogeny says, so amongst my family, oh, we're all different. You know, I'm different than my mother. I'm different than my daughter. We're all different in my group. But when I look at your group, you guys are all the same. Look at you, you all look just alike. You're all interested in the same kind of things. And that's what's meant by out-group homogamy. Homogamy, if you take that H-O-M-O, homo, the same. So out-group homogamy says that they are all alike, but we are all different. Take that back to the first part of the chapter when we were talking about actor-observer bias, right? It's the same kind of thing, that when I'm looking at somebody else, I put them all together. They're all the same. All 15-year-olds are the same. But when we're talking about, you know, all 49-year-old women, we're all really different. You can't put us all in the same category. That's what that one means. We're all the same, and we're all different, and you're all the same. It's also interesting to me, there's this term in your psychology textbook, this is a very sociological term, and that's ethnocentrism. And this is a fancy term for basically in-group and out-group, for in-group, for in-group and out-group differences. And if you want to take this word apart, you end up with ethno, which means culture, and centrism, kind of like self-centered. And so it's like cultural self-centered. Ethnocentrism says my culture is right and normal and everybody else is weird. So this is, and then in sociology we talk about cultural relativism, but this image here sort of captures that. I think this is one of my very favorite illustrations of ethnocentrism. And you have both women basically interpreting the behavior of the other the same way because they're coming from their in-group differences, right? So she's saying, you have this woman over here in the and that covering, and she's saying, look at that, nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture, right? And you have the woman in the bikini who's saying the same thing. She says, everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. I'm coming from my own cultural perspective that I understand really well, and I'm looking at yours and I'm thinking, boy, you're all the same, right? You're all different. I'm going to stop here and come back and we'll talk about conformity.